Fukushima Daiichi accident is one of the most serious and complex disasters which human beings have ever had to deal with.
Is continuing to leak out of the reactors.
Crisis level at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant from 5 to 7, the same level as the 1986 Chernobyl accident in the former Soviet Union, and the worst on the international scale.
On March 11, 2011, Fukushima triggered a reassessment of the pros and cons of nuclear energy, and it has generated the beginning of a discussion long overdue. Following Fukushima, it is easy to become preoccupied with the risks presented by nuclear energy. But there are also benefits. While it is unclear which outweighs the other, the future role of nuclear technology must be evaluated objectively based on informed discussion.
The world has lived with an understanding of nuclear fission for 60 or 70 years, but are we going to be able to live with it for 500 years?
Post-Fukushima, we seem to be in a situation of flux. So some countries are continuing with nuclear power, some countries are starting nuclear power, but a number of other countries like Germany, for example, seem to be stopping nuclear power. So it's all very uncertain at the moment.
It's unclear what the future will be, but I think definitely nuclear power is an option that deserves to be considered on its merit.
After Fukushima, there was a panicked search for answers. The facts of the incident have often become obscured by rumors and assumptions.
Japan's health ministry has decided to begin conducting radiation checks on all food products for infants every 3 months. The move comes after a leading food company announced earlier this week that it had found radioactive cesium in its powdered milk.
The International Atomic Energy Agency, meanwhile, says the latest food sample data indicates contamination is below dangerous levels.
For the first time, residents of some towns near the Fukushima Daiichi plant found out how much radiation they face.
In a public address, Japanese Prime Minister Kan said radiation from the damaged Fukushima Daiichi plant is decreasing.
The situation is not stable at all. So you're looking at basically a ticking time bomb.
In order to draw accurate conclusions, it is important to understand the true sequence of events at the Fukushima Daiichi reactor.
Fukushima was a nuclear accident on the back of a truly horrendous natural disaster. Unlike, for instance, 3 Mile Island, which was a lot of human error on the back of a relatively small technical issue, and Chernobyl, where, although it was a bad design, there was nothing wrong with that reactor on the day the ghost guys went to work and blew it up. Fukushima is not like that.
No single person lost their life as a consequence of the nuclear disaster in Japan, but numbers of people, many thousands of people, very tragically and sadly lost their lives due to the natural processes that were going on. So to a certain extent, I would argue that Fukushima showed how vigilant we must be in thinking about old designs of reactors, in considering turning old reactors off and not being frightened to do that. But at the same time, it showed us that even a 1960s designed reactor that was at the very end of its lifetime it was, even in the worst natural circumstances, was not in fact an environmental disaster. It was a local disaster.
Very few people were made sick, if anyone, from the accident. Even the workers seem to have escaped relatively with low doses. The real problem is that there's been an enormous economic disruption to the Fukushima region. There's people who will remain displaced for decades as a result of the accident. And I think those economic consequences will really make, maybe not normal everyday people rethink nuclear power, but the people who will finance nuclear power, the people who will want nuclear plants, utility companies, they're going to think twice about it. And I think it probably will delay nuclear in the long term.
However, new nuclear technologies currently being researched and developed could reduce the economic risks as well as the safety risks associated with nuclear energy.
So building a nuclear power station now is not the same proposition as building something with a vulnerability which it became clear that the reactors built at Fukushima had. So the root of the problem was the coolant didn't remain circulating in the core. The way water-cooled reactors are now designed is such that if the reactor is shut down, then the coolant circulates not because a pump is driving it, but using natural circulation. So just relying on the fact that heat into the water causes buoyancy effects. So if you design your coolant circuits correctly, those buoyancy effects by themselves are sufficient for circulation to continue. Therefore, certainly the Fukushima scenario results in shut down reactors, but shut down safely, and once infrastructure is back to normal, you can just switch them back on and away you go, generating again.
In the very early days of nuclear power, we tried lots of different types of technology. We tried thorium, we tried fast reactors, we tried metal fuels, we tried oxide fuels. We really went through a whole series of different types of technologies before the economics really pushed us down to thinking about essentially light water reactors mostly. However, we're now starting to rediscover some of those technologies that we were looking at some time ago, but we're doing that with very new materials and, of course, computer systems which are able to control reactor systems much more readily. So I think we are going back to, as it were, the future with fast reactors in particular, but with also alternative fuel types. So it's quite an exciting period of time for nuclear energy.
Because thorium as a nuclear material is what's called fertile rather than fissile, so it will undergo fission with very high energy neutrons, but it's not readily fissionable. But if you get it to capture get a thorium-232 nucleus to capture a neutron, then 2 beta decays later you arrive at uranium-233, which is fissile. And you've therefore got a way of converting a very plentiful and not widely used natural resource into a potential source of energy. Thorium is 3 to 4 times more abundant than uranium, and therefore represents a significant energy resource if you can exploit it.
The basic science of fusion is that in conventional nuclear power you have fission. You have a uranium atom and a little nucleus or a little neutron comes in and splits it apart, and that releases energy. In fusion you have 2 very light atoms and they come together and they create a heavier atom, and that creates energy as well. In the case of ITER, it's isotopes of hydrogen that are actually doing the fusing, so it is deuterium and tritium, which is hydrogen with 1 and 2 extra neutrons respectively. The advantages of it is that per unit mass you get a lot more energy out, and you don't have long-lived radioactive byproducts from fusion power. But the disadvantage is just a lot harder to do. Obviously, like magnets, 2 positively charged nuclei repel each other, and so overcoming that repulsion is very, very difficult. And that's really what's been plaguing the fusion community for the past 50 years or so.
If we are at the horse and cart era, right, in terms of fusion, by the time my children are old, I find it difficult to believe the same technological leaps won't have occurred.
Adequate funding is needed in order to pursue these innovative nuclear technologies. And yet, despite the potential of nuclear energy, receiving such funding is not easy.
Well, thinking about the risks of nuclear power, the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that it is uneconomical. There was never a business case, never a commercial legitimacy for nuclear power generation. Since the 1950s it was clear that it would be expensive. There was a hope that costs would come down over time, but experience has shown that the more we actually build nuclear power plants and all the equipment around it, the more expensive it becomes.
Everywhere where you have an energy market, a free market, new nuclear power plants are too expensive, and you can only build them up with subsidies from the federal, from government, for example. It's the same in the US, it's the same in the United Kingdom, where nobody wants to build up new nuclear power plant because it's too expensive.
Nuclear energy policy is very much part of energy policy. And I subscribe to the view that energy policy is driven by three factors. Economics, security of supply, and the environment. These are the three main issues that nuclear energy has to be considered against, I would suggest. And for a country like the United Kingdom, broadly, it looks attractive right now in terms of energy security. It looks attractive in terms of environment, interpreted through the lens of climate change. But economics is difficult.
Nobody knows the cost of nuclear power, because if you have one incident like in Fukushima now, the costs are extremely high and nobody can pay that.
The initial costs of nuclear energy are often daunting, and concern for public approval has stagnated nuclear debate.
Any accident anywhere in the world, whether there's a reason for this or not, could lead to a change in policy, which could mean that, and these are very capital intensive plant, that the 5-10 billion or whatever they spent in that plant is then useless. So that policy risk is enormous. So it's not really to do with safety or radiation, it's to do with policy, which is to do with the public perception and the public reaction. And that's really quite difficult to forecast or to manage.
A particularly clear instance of political stagnation can be seen in the issue of nuclear waste disposal.
Many countries are presently have a policy of no policy, somehow have a policy of saying there is no urgency to decide, in interim storage they are safe, we have still to survey, control them, but we can delay the decision because it is very difficult to get public acceptance of an actual repository. And so it's interesting to see that Finland and Sweden, which are democracies, have gone all the way to the process of political acceptance. It took a long time.
Now, in fact, new nuclear technologies will produce a lot less additional waste per kilowatt of energy generated. So we need to explain that. But at the end of the day, we have to dispose of our nuclear waste. Technologically, we can do that. We can reprocess, we can turn a lot of the nuclear waste into glass blocks, which are much more concentrated nuclear waste, so you're reducing the volume. You're not reducing the amount of nuclear activity, but you are reducing the volume. We can also dispose of spent fuel directly. So there are numbers of technologies which we can use to do this, but they have to be demonstrated. And what we failed to do is really demonstrate it to enough of the world's population. And so it remains a priority. But I think it's a technologically solvable issue, without question.
The technologies for safe disposal of nuclear waste exist, and the barrier is political decision making to decide on a site and go with it. But it really is ultimately now a political issue, not a technical issue.
it seems to me, because they've got all this waste, they really have to find a solution that people can live with. Because whatever decisions we make now about what we might do in future, the problem is still there. So it's not, in a way that makes it easier politically, because you don't have to, in a sense, take responsibility for the decision. You just have to say, look, we have a problem, we have to find a solution to it, and no one can challenge that. The problem's there. So ultimately, I think a solution has to be found.
But nuclear energy cannot be looked at in isolation. It must be considered alongside other energy options, namely renewables and fossil fuels.
Nuclear power is just one way of generating electricity. So the real subject is energy. Do we need energy or not? And you know that it is really at the crux of the big dilemma we have to face in this beginning of 21st century. How can we conciliate somehow the need for development on the one hand and the protection of the environment on the others? And energy is really at the crux of the matter, because without access to energy there is no development. But let's face it, if we go on using and producing energy the way we do, and taking into account the huge development of billions of people, which is the good news, then in terms of our environment we are really doomed for a catastrophe.
The peak oil is driving up the price for not only for oil but for gas and for coal. And therefore the fossil fuel prices will rise as well. And this is the reason why I think that very soon we will have a completely changed picture in the energy landscape worldwide.
Everywhere in the world, US, Great Britain, France, everywhere we have to invest in energy infrastructure, because that what we have today is old. The reactors are old, the grids are old, everything is very old, because the last 10, 20 years there was no big investment in the energy sector. So everywhere in the world we have to invest. And the question is not should we invest or not. We only have to ask where should we invest.
So in Germany we are really strongly developing the renewable energy system, and we are phasing into the renewable age and into renewable energy. And I think therefore people can better make their decision. They can say we want the nuclear or we want the renewable. And as far as our scientists have told us and everybody that we can make it with 100% renewable energy, people always say, talk, we want renewable, we don't want nuclear, whoosh. People make this, and it's a very strong public decision and opinion, if you like.
The nature of renewables is that pretty much all of them are, to some extent or other, intermittent, whether it's to do with the sun going down every night, or the wind not always blowing, or the size of the tides changing with the seasons and these sorts of things. So you need much more infrastructure to have a resilient electricity grid to cope with all the variations.
Clearly renewables have a role to play, and it's clear that today fossil fuels have a role to play. And I see nuclear sitting alongside those things. I also see benefit in diversity. I think that to have a wholly nuclear electricity system would, for instance, be a move away from goodness in energy security terms. So I'm very focused on the idea to provide options for the future.
We have to reduce drastically the use of oil, coal and gas. And if you do that, you don't have so many choices. It's nuclear and renewables. So we cannot shoot ourselves in the foot and say, okay, let's forget about nuclear. This big problem, nuclear is part of the solution, is not part of the problem.
I'm personally slightly doubtful that we'll ever get to a position where we don't need something which can deliver large amounts of energy with a small footprint in terms of land usage, etc., and with continuing concerns about climate change and not wanting to use fossil fuels to do that, then I suspect nuclear will carry on having a role, although personally I would be very happy if it was a diminishing role, because we could do more and more electricity generation cost effectively through renewable means.
Even if the economics of nuclear were simple, some of the political hesitancy also stems from a fear of nuclear proliferation.
Actually, having the nuclear energy enterprise actually does help a country to have, if not the real capability to manufacture nuclear weapons, but at least the kind of what people usually call a virtual capability or a theoretical capability.
If you spread a nuclear power, you spread the knowledge about nuclear physics. So the first proliferation is proliferation of brains somehow. But the genie is already out of the bottle. Since July 16, 1945, we know it is possible to make a nuclear weapon.
So there are, of course, systems in place which are designed to prevent that states which have nuclear power, which develop nuclear power in the nuclear fuel cycle, could easily go into the nuclear weapons direction.
The United States and Israel both assess that Iran does not yet have a nuclear weapon. And we are exceedingly vigilant in monitoring their program.
And I don't think decisions about nuclear power generation, one way or the other, stop a group who wants to get hold of some nuclear materials to create some dirty bombs from doing it. It might, conceivably in some scenarios, make it a bit easier, but I don't think it's that difficult now if they really, really want to do it, because there's lots of radioactive stuff out there. You know, if you just harvest it from fire detectors, for example. You might need to do a lot of it, but radioactive materials are widely used for, you know, legitimate purposes.
If you have a very large nuclear energy complex, that, as we discussed, that actually allows for a spread of technologies, facilities, technical capabilities, expertise. That makes proliferation easier. But that doesn't mean that if you sort of shut down all nuclear power plants that you would eliminate the danger of nuclear proliferation entirely. No, not at all.
Given the complexity of the issue, the balance of risks and benefits will vary from country to country.
I think it's a real open question how nuclear power will move forward in the future. The plants are nearing the end of their lifetimes, and really the question is, are people going to build new nuclear, or are they going to build something else? At the moment, the capital cost of building a nuclear plant in a Western country like the UK or America is so high that people actually don't want to do it. They just see it as too much of a risk. And when I say people, I mean the actual venture capital who would be financing these plants. And so there is a real question as to whether nuclear is going to continue to be as strong a part of the energy mix as it is right now. I think, you know, the alternatives are kind of equally bad in certain ways. I mean, if we don't have nuclear, we got to get energy from somewhere, and that somewhere is going to be coal, natural gas. And without carbon capture technology, these will pose significant environmental challenges, really.
I think humanity is going to need all the technologies available to it. Whether or not, where the balance in the different technologies lies, I think would depend on the countries you're talking about. For some countries, nuclear will be a very small part of their energy mix, and probably not at all. I think other countries are going to be much more dependent on nuclear energy. I think France will continue to be much more dependent on nuclear energy. I think China will become more dependent on nuclear energy, so will Russia.
It's also important to remember that in the developing world, in China and India and Brazil in particular, there's a very active interest in nuclear power, and there's a lot of new build being done. And what we may end up seeing, I suppose, is some of that expertise and technologies coming back into the West and maybe providing nuclear plants at a lower cost.
Germany, we have a term for the societal conflict over nuclear power. We call it a grand societal conflict, gesellschaftlicher Großkonflikt.
I actually think the risks with nuclear are all that great, but for a number of reasons to do with the way people perceive risk, they will be seen as greater, and that's an inevitable part of the politics of it. It's the sort of risk that is very scary to the public because it's invisible and because it's outside normal experience.
People don't really, understand nuclear power. They have a lot of fear of radiation, and they haven't really had the option to make these decisions on their own.
I'm not averse to, public concern about nuclear energy. I think it's very appropriate.
The question is, do people really want to learn about it? Most people don't care where their electricity comes from, and so even if you have the resources, that doesn't mean that people are going to use them until there's an accident or something big that happens.
People are generally much more intelligent than we sometimes give the general population credit for.
I think politicians need to be brave enough to recognise that I think a lot of the voting population are intelligent enough to take on board arguments about long-term sustainability, issues about climate change. Well, these are things which need, decision-making horizons which look over tens, hundreds of years rather than half a decade.
Should there be a broader public debate about nuclear? Probably.
I think through television in particular, I think through websites, by discussions.
So I think it's appropriate for the public to be vigilant and questioning about nuclear policy.
And I think a lot of the population are willing to think in those terms if the arguments are put to them.
We must be aware, that's humanity in general.
Talk about things and get challenged about things. Discuss the less comfortable questions, okay? And continue to talk about these things. So that and engage people.